Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and I'm happy to be here to help with Spirit Week. While we're virtual, I think it's especially also important. And I'm here to kind of get us talking about story and how it connects people. Specifically, we're going to start with myth because I think that's a very important part of early story. But I want to take us beyond that and go into what story means to people and what it can mean to you, right? So when I start talking about stories in my classes, I like to use the quote that God created man because he loved to hear a story. And the reason I like this quote is for exactly the very reason you might think I wouldn't like it, which is that it's very hard to exactly pin down. If you Google it, you're probably going to get activist and writer Wiesel because it's in his books when he talks about his Holocaust experience. If you look further, you'll see Judaic connections. If you look further than that, some people claim there's similar statements in ancient societies. Some people claim African origins. And you might wonder why that excites me versus vexes me. And the truth is, there's some things that, yes, I want to be concretely contributed to a certain culture at a certain time because I feel I need to know that. But I think this works best being universal in essence, because what it says is that the story is not a cultural phenomenon for one group. It's not a geographical phenomenon. The story is a human phenomenon. It's part of who we are. It's our very essence. We couldn't change it if we wanted to. And even better, in the quote, it has divine connection. So basically, we're divinely ordained to have this story flowing through us. It's interwoven into our fabric of our being, into our DNA. It's the very essence of being human is to tell stories. And I think also that's very powerful for the relevance that it holds, right? That's not only true for past myths, it's true for today. The story may evolve, the characters may change, but we're still engaging in ourselves through story. So if we're going to start a little discussion of this story and the journey of the story, because we only have 10 minutes, I think we should start at myth just to kind of pin down what myth is, because there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes with this. So myths are stories true, and mythology is the study of myths. But a myth is not just any story. So a myth is not just some random story you make up off the top of your head to pass the time while you're at a campfire. It's not some book you read and later forget the end of it. A myth is something you would carry with you. A myth is actually foundational, sometimes considered an origin story. It might include religion, gods and goddesses, pantheons, which is a group of gods and goddesses. It may include demigods, which is a mortal and a god. It may include superpower beings. It may include fantastical stories and travels and even journeys to the underworld, right? So you may have a whole kind of spiritual essence in it. Along with that, though, you can also see a very concrete idea of how to model human behavior and how the community as a whole addresses the great dichotomies and questions of life, like, for example, good and evil, justice and injustice. Where does that all, life and death, war and peace, where does that all kind of fit in? How do I navigate that? And some will actually tell you how to navigate positions in the community, like how to deal with people in certain political conditions or how to deal with elders. And some talk about how to have certain values that are upheld in the community. Like, for example, if you look at myths from ancient Greece, if you look at heroes and how they interact during war, you see that it's a great honor to fight for your country. In fact, there's a poem from a World War I soldier who is very distraught by his experiences. And he basically pleads to people, don't fall for the old, epic, ancient Greece, ancient Roman lie, how sweet it is to die for one's country. That's kind of the way this is set up. And then you might see things that they don't value or that they warn against, like hubris, excessive pride, right? Try to avoid it. You'll see balances like, for example, Sophrosine, right? The concept of balance is the idea that you should have a balanced life to live a good life. And you can see this in the pantheon as well. So if you have a god who's very logical and rational, like Apollo, you're going to have a counterpart that's more emotional, like Dionysus. And so you get all these elements of what it means to be in the culture, cultural markers, as I call them, being carried and passed through myths. And a lot of these probably come to you today largely in epics. That's probably how you have engaged in a lot of myths. So, for example, if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you may have heard stories about the pantheon and about heroes with that. And if you ever thought of them as just that, here's this, crazy story about these monsters and all things like that. Hopefully, as you've seen from our introduction to myth, that is our first myth misconception, right? Which is that these are purely fantastical stories. They have grounding, they have importance, they carry philosophy about ethics. There were scientists who were mythographers too, by the way. Different writers have talked about the pantheon as being a physical embodiment of different morals and moralities. There are others who talk about them embodying different elements of Earth, like, for example, how Mars was the god of vegetation, as well as the god of war. So it was used as a way to understand science and life cycles and pretty much everything about the world. There were writers who talked about the fact that you could take a myth and find another level for it. So, for example, you have Europa being carried away by Zeus as a bull. What if that wasn't the only story? What if there was a woman who was kidnapped by someone from Crete named Tauros because they're connected to bulls? What if for Odysseus, there was a very prominent ship that was attacked by forces like pirates? You know, there's other ways that you can explain these stories happening in real life as well. There's even a movement of rationalism, which is the scrutiny of myth, coming from ancient Greece, called a humorism, based on the writings of the humorists. And he talked about a fictional trip he had where he went to an island and he saw a gold statue, and on it were names associated with, to the Greeks, with gods like Uranus and Kronos. And it made him realize that these were kings of the area, and that over time, venerating these people who had been these great benefactors had turned them into gods in stories. And so branches of humorism look for historical grounding in myths and historical predecessors. And I think that's important for us today too, for our stories and our culture and how we view people when we tell stories. I don't necessarily think we're taking our celebrities, our sports figures, and imbuing them with enough power that they're going to become gods later on down the line. But we do have great benefactors to society that we put up on pedestals, that we devote ourselves to, our time, our money, and that we do devote stories to, which we know now is a very kingly gift and one of the most amazing things we can give someone. So I do think that human nature to want to take people and have kind of this heroic imbuing of them and having this heroic narrative is something that we still engage in to some extent today. Which brings us to another major myth misconception I want to address, which is the idea that myth is ancient and static and in the past. Myth has evolved, myth has moved with humanity, myth has been used historically, even though you might think it doesn't go into the realm of history because you can't prove certain actions of gods and things like that. There's so much more going on in myths. Heinrich Schliemann, though a horrible archaeologist, and yes, should be very reprimanded for his actions, did show that you could use these stories geographically and historically to find artifacts. You have groups who have used stories to interact in points of contact. For example, Christian missionaries would sometimes use mythology to help to explain Christianity to groups. And we know this because we have Native American origin stories that have been written down and have been changed over the years to include more Christian spiritual elements after points of contact. So we have very interesting ways that you can use myth to understand cultures and to tap into understanding how their world works and how they see themselves. And with that, we still are influenced by it today. Maybe you're not going to write the next great myth. Maybe no one's going to make a civilization based on, your understandings and values. But we have taken into our concept of stories today that some stories are narratively connected to how we see our values and ourselves, and that they go beyond just being an entertaining tale. For example, Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, also using a fantastical idea and Ring of Invisibility to basically introduce concepts of loyalty, family, and also too, by the way, languages. You can learn Elvish. You learn a whole language off his work. Harry Potter. There are people now who go around talking about what house they're in, and they'll even attribute to different aspects of their personality. I'm up studying past 2 a.m. Well, you know me, I'm Ravenclaw. And it's like that's just become part of who they are. And it might not be a myth to them. They might not really truly believe this or make their whole selves off of it, but it has culturally affected them. It's still a significant story. I think comic books are starting to become very significant in the current modern story of who we are. And comic books are starting to show people morality and, again, using great powers, but to use it in a way that shows humanity. So through great power, comes great responsibility, forgive me, to humanity. And in this regards, I think we can also see some ways that our stories might be different based on our value judgments as a culture. So for example, if you look at the pantheon in myth, a lot of times these are opposite forces and moralities coming together. They do interact with humans, but they don't necessarily interact with humans in an ideal way. The gods could have some of the more base human characteristics. They could be vain. They could be jealous. They started the Trojan War where it was most beautiful, right? And with that, humans could be pawns in their game. They can make them do horrible things just to perpetuate, their idea of what should happen, or to put them, over another god or goddess in a debate. So I think in our modern world, you see that changed with our superpowered human beings. When you have a group of superpowered human beings that come together to try to work with humanity, like let's say the Avengers, oftentimes, although they have disagreements, they represent different strengths and different values and ideals. They do so in a way to try to come together for the good of humanity. And there might be collateral damage, there may be issues, but they're trying overall to connect in a positive way. And I think that shows how much we value ourselves in this world and how much we want to see ourselves reflected in these superpowered individuals. And by the way, I do think you all hold a lot of power. And so let's go ahead and take that as kind of the evolution of what we see today. The fact that myth is even directly involved in our comic books, right, with Thor and Loki, although please keep in mind these are adapted versions, very different than Thor, Loki, and mythology. And let's kind of use that to go into our modern story and what we're doing with it. I know that you guys probably feel very disconnected from the pandemic. I do as well. I miss you. I'm sure you miss your campus, your professors. But I think one of the things that has happened from this pandemic is that we have come together online as one college, and it's a strong college. And I think that's because you all have brought your diverse backgrounds, your questions, your perspectives, and you've brought them all into our online discussion boards and into our emails. And you've basically enriched the culture of Valencia. Valencia has assembled, and we're stronger together than we are solo. And I will tell you this, I am sure that you all will have amazing stories and impact on the future when this is done. And I look forward to hearing your stories later. And so I'll let you go ahead and have Spirit Week and start connecting and making those stories. And I'll just leave you with the thought that, God needs stories. Humanity needs stories. I know I definitely need stories. And I definitely know that Valencia needs students like you and needs for you to contribute to the stories of our college. Thank you very much for doing so. And I hope you have a great